Well, welcome everybody. My name is Ben Pink-Dandelion. I'm part of the learning and research team at Woodbrook, and my particular area of responsibility is to look after the Centre for Research in... welcome everybody. My name is Ben Pink-Dandelion. I'm part of the learning and research
team. You need to mute something there.
Yeah. The area of responsibility is to... Sorry. Do you beg your pardon about that? Sorry. Okay, my particular area of responsibility is look after the our postgraduate work and the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies. And with me today, as part of our Meet the Supervisors series, is Rhiannon Grant, who's the Deputy Programme Leader in Research at Woodbrook. And we're going to spend the next half an hour to an hour just talking about your work, Rhiannon, and Supervision and the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Okay. So, I mean, I wondered if we could start by you talking through sort of your academic career, where it began, whether you always wanted to be an academic, what you've studied and where.
Yeah, so I don't know. Have I always wanted to be an academic? Maybe, actually. I've certainly wanted to be an academic for quite a long time. And I remember, I think at the point of choosing A-levels, having a conversation with my mother and her saying, "What do you really want to do?" And I said, well, I have heard of a job that I really like the sound of, but I don't know how many opportunities there are to actually do that. And she said, "Oh yeah, what job is that?" And I said, "Well, I've heard that there's someone called Ben Pink-Dandelion who's Professor of Quaker Studies. And that sounds like a good job." So in some sense, I've been moving in this direction for quite a long time. But on the way, I've explored lots of other possibilities. So I think as a teenager, I was quite frustrated with my Quaker community not wanting to answer questions about philosophy and theology. And I got very excited by doing philosophy of religion at A-level, and said, yes, Richard Swinburne, people being very logical about religion, this is what we need, which I'm not sure I agree with now, but when I was like 18, that was the cutting edge. It was very exciting. And so I went to university. I went to the University of Nottingham, and I did a joint honours degree in philosophy and theology. And in the course of that, I really enjoyed lots of things about that. It was really good to be in both departments. And so, for example, the two departments use different referencing systems. So I got really comfortable with some of that kind of academic mechanics and switching between different disciplines and things like that, which has definitely stood me in good stead for what I do now with the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies. I also got a bit fed up with some of that. So particularly there was some of theology where I was involved in the student council and mechanisms for students giving feedback to academics about what we wanted to see in the syllabus and things. And we'd come along with groundbreaking new ideas, like maybe we should read more women in our reading lists, maybe there should be more feminist scholars. And some of the academics there would say, "Oh, that's so 20 years ago, we've been through all this before," but they hadn't updated their reading lists. And you couldn't see why. I might get fed up with that, I think. And so I decided, actually, there's stuff in this, things about gender and sexuality that people are not talking about, and they need more research. So I went to the University of Leeds, and I did a master's degree with the Centre for Interdisciplinary not Quaker Studies, that's the other one, Centre for Interdisciplinary Gender Studies. And yeah, so again, that interdisciplinary theme, kind of exploring different things, but working with lots of different approaches. And I did a master's degree called Gender, Sexuality and Queer Theory, which covered lots of feminist history, women's studies, but also sexuality, queer theory, looking at Judith Butler, looking at postmodernism. And actually, I came back round to working on religion again, and the dissertation that I wrote for that master's degree was on Jewish and Christian uses of feminist religious language. So that kind of, it came back to my roots in the sense of going back to doing religion and thinking there is something there that I'm really interested in. But also it put me on this path to studying religious language, which I picked up in my PhD work. So having found that working with Rachel Mewers, who supervised my MA dissertation, was a really good experience, Rachel and I had some conversations about what would be a good thing to do a PhD in. And the one that I decided to focus on was to look at Quaker uses of religious language, and particularly how Quakers talk about God and different ways of talking about God, and is God masculine or feminine had been quite a major theme in my master's work. And I picked that up and looked at it from a more philosophical angle rather than just the feminist angle for my PhD work. And in particular, I was quite interested in language, but I got a bit annoyed with some of the postmodernist stuff that seemed very kind of vague, and as soon as you thought you'd got hold of it, it disappeared again. So instead of going down that route, I used a philosopher called Wittgenstein to be the philosophical basis for my PhD work, and looked at lots of his approaches to language, which are very focused on language as something we use for communication, language as something that happens in the moment, in a context, in a community, and focused on the function rather than the structure of it.
So, and what did you use for data about how Quakers talked about God? Were you interviewing people, or were you using documents and articles?
Yeah, so when I started, I assumed that Quakers don't talk about God, and I'd have to do interviews to make them say things that were interesting. But when I started my literature review, it turned out that I was wrong about that. And in fact, there was this huge body of Quaker publications, actually. I started with the whole 20th century, and I narrowed it down in time period, but lots of just quite ephemeral publications, booklets, pamphlets, short books, things that were written by committees to be useful to other committees. And yeah, and I had to narrow that data in several ways. So I left out everything that was in the Friend, because there's a huge amount there, and that was just too much to be dealing with. And I narrowed the time period as well to look at like only the last 50 years roughly, because actually there was so much published material. Wow. And that gave me a really rich body of material to not really do something quantitative, not to try and count the occurrences, but to pick out examples and philosophically interesting patterns.
Okay. And did you have any space or time to look at change over that 50-year period, or did you take it as a single block of material?
Yeah, and I did try to look for change. I think that it wasn't quite as obvious in the sampling method that I was using. If I'd put everything into an electronic corpus, I might have picked out change in a different way. But the philosophical method, right? So actually, Wittgenstein used to sit in his deck chair and just think of an example. And I was a bit more based in the real world than that. Yeah. And I had these actual published examples. But I didn't have the full picture because I couldn't collect all of them into one place. So I did pick up some changes, but it was difficult to really be sure about them. And I think there's more work to do there. In fact, one of the things I'm saying in I could have taken a different approach is there's still quite a lot more work to do on that body of material.
And if you could sum up your kind of main arguments from the thesis, what would they be?
I think the main argument from the thesis is something like Quakers do talk about God, and actually they have really creative ways of balancing different tensions. And in particular, I picked up two kind of almost opposite goals. One is to create unity and to keep unity in the community, and the other is to have diversity and to celebrate diversity in the community. And in particular, I looked at the way that Quakers have used lists of names. So they say things like God or the light or the spirit or love or whatever you call it. And by having a single list, you keep that sense of unity. These are all somehow synonyms for the same thing, even though they're different words. And we all agree, really, even though we use different language. But you also make that diversity very explicit. And you say, we do use different language. Don't be surprised when you encounter that. If you use different words, you're still welcome. And lots of them finish with, or whatever you call it, or it's a beautiful example that finishes just ... with an ellipsis. You fill in your own here. And so there's that sense of wanting to keep the diversity and make it explicit and be welcoming of it at the same time as trying to keep that unity. So Quakers have been really creative and inventive in ways of holding that tension that doesn't have to be damaging for the community. You might expect it to be damaging, but it isn't necessarily when it can be held in this positive way.
Wow, that's a lovely insight. Yeah, very, very neat. I mean, we were going slightly off your research, but I mean, that would raise the question for me about theism and non-theism, and does that same mechanism allow? I mean, I suppose in some ways non-theists would also use other terms or would add to the list.
Yeah, so the list is particularly strong on including terms from maybe other faith traditions, or including terms that are both some traditional Christian terms and some others. So going back to gender, quite a lot of them, if they include the word father, they also include mother. So you have that kind of balance included. Some non-theists find that kind of approach works well for them. And so you do see lists with obviously non-theist or attempting to be inclusive of non-theist perspectives terms in them. So terms like energy or universe, something that might be is capable of being understood in a more naturalistic way than some of the perhaps words that have connotations of supernaturalism. But there are other ones where actually the underlying unity of the list suggests mono non-theism.
Okay, yes.
And it suggests that there's one thing, that we're all in touch with the same reality, even if we understand that in very different ways and have different personal experiences of it. And that it bumps into problems both when you try and include what we might call a firm or a hard polytheism, where there actually are multiple deities, there actually are several beings. And it also comes into a problem with a firm naturalist or materialist non-theism, where there is no deeper reality. There's actually just what we can see and hear and touch. And so, yeah, it depends on a kind of a mystical compromise of saying, well, there is something, but we're not sure what it is. And maybe that's where we could talk about it in terms of the absolute perhaps that you've talked about in your work.
Oh, okay. No, that's fair. Interesting. So you finished the PhD at Leeds with working with Rachel Muirs.
Yeah.
And then what happened for you? Because it's a notoriously difficult job market.
Yeah, so I graduated from Leeds, and in fact, on my graduation day, I had a Skype interview, which I had to take in a spare office on campus. And I was already doing bits of teaching in different places. So what I ended up doing for the next couple of years was lots of part-time work at different universities. In those days, of course, we were mostly teaching in person. So there were some weeks where I reckoned I'd done 1,000 miles on the train going round to different campuses. So I'd be teaching at Leeds Trinity University on Monday and Tuesday, and then I'd be down at Canterbury Christchurch on Thursday, and then I'd be up to Wolverhampton on Friday, and then Canterbury Christchurch also have a campus in London, and I'd be there on Saturday for a few hours. And in between times on the train, I'd be trying to do a research project for the Unitarians and write a grant application for another research project and another job application, and also get out a journal article to keep my own academic career going. Yes. So yeah, it was exhausting actually, and a lot of it was really good experiences, and I really enjoyed teaching. I really enjoyed working with undergraduates. I really enjoyed teaching in that diversity of universities, and particularly some of the work I did with students from less traditional backgrounds, where maybe people had had a long gap since they did their A-levels, or they'd come in through a different route without necessarily going down the academic A-levels route. But yeah, in terms of job security, there was very, very little of that around.
Yeah. So, and is that when you came to Woodbrook? Was Woodbrook the kind of the stable light at the end of that tunnel?
Yeah, so I actually came to Woodbrook on a very temporary basis because I was an Eva Cox scholar over the summer. So I came to Woodbrook at the time when an Eva Cox scholarship meant forming a small community for about 6 weeks over the summer. So I moved to Birmingham for 6 weeks, and then while I was staying at Woodbrook, had a job interview at Woodbrook, and ended up moving to Birmingham permanently, which, yeah, I think that's it worked out well. It was a bit nerve-wracking, and if somebody had to come to me and say, you haven't got the job at Woodbrook even though you're living there, that would have been quite a difficult situation for us all. But yeah, so I was doing a research project about afterwards as part of my Eva Cox scholarship, and I was working on that at Woodbrook, and then yeah, got this part-time job 3 days a week at Woodbrook, and that was the stability that took me out of doing little bits of part-time teaching at lots of different universities. I still do a little bit. I do some undergraduate teaching a few times a year at the University of Birmingham, but nothing like the amounts that I was doing for that couple of years.
Okay. And obviously our main connection as the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies is with the University of Birmingham. So that's been good in terms of us being involved with the department there. And you're now an honorary senior lecturer in the department, which is great.
Yeah.
So, you work 3 days a week. Is that partly deliberate? I mean, I know you want to give time to your writing and research as well.
Yeah, so I work 3 days a week. I actually spread those hours out over the 5 days of the week, especially now I'm working from home. And so my pattern is usually to do a couple of hours writing in the morning and then move on to the Woodbrook and research work later in the day. And that seems to work well for me. So I've had several books out in the last few years, both as a writer and things that I've been editing. And yeah, that it gives me a balance and that ability, all those things I was juggling on the train while I was trying to do lots of teaching, I can balance much more easily with that 3 days a week, but also doing the equivalent of 2 days a week on writing and my own research projects.
And is there any advice you'd give to somebody who is in that kind of in the job market at the moment, and I mean, having that kind of experience that you did of taking bits here and bits there?
I mean, I think you have to be realistic about what you can do, but you also have to be realistic about the job market. And actually, if you want to work in universities, that is what it's like at the moment. So I guess I'd say you're not alone. A lot of people are having that experience. Some of it is down to luck and also other forms of social privilege and whether you fit in. And you know, I would always wonder whether it was difficult to get a university job, particularly in some of these fields which are still very dominated by men, because I'm a woman, but on the other hand I am white, and if I was a black woman it would be even harder probably. So I think it's worth being really aware of those broader structural factors, and not necessarily to assume that everything that's happening is about you as a person or you as an individual.
No, that's helpful.
Yeah.
And I mean, we will come on to supervising soon, but what about the role of, you know, attending conferences and either both presenting or just being there to network and meet people? How important do you think that is?
It's really useful if you can do it. It's one of the things that I found really difficult to do when I was in that position of rushing around teaching all over the place, partly because of actually finding the time and energy to go, but also because none of the universities I was working for felt that it was their responsibility to support me financially in going to conferences. And so sometimes I could apply for a bursary, and that's very helpful. But I think if I was in that position again now, I would probably find it easier to participate in some of that stuff because so many more conferences are blended. And it's not the same networking opportunity to attend a conference online, but particularly if you can present a paper, that gives people an opportunity to hear about your work, to interact with you, maybe in the questions afterwards, to get to know who you are. And if you can attend some papers and drop someone an email afterwards or something, I think you can find ways to make that work for you as a networking opportunity as well. And I'm really glad that so many academic conferences are offering that option, particularly for scholars who are in that kind of position that I was in.
Yeah, no, good. So you mentioned doing the work on afterwards, which was obviously post PhD. What other research have you been able to do since your PhD?
So the other major project that I've done post PhD was a project about trying to find the core of liberal Quaker theology. So where some projects look for the edges, and you mentioned non-theism earlier, and quite a lot of people have written about where's the edge, how far out can you go before it's not Quaker theology anymore. But I wanted to go the other way and look for what's the centre, what actually do liberal Quakers keep saying and say with confidence and say in different contexts. So I did a project which resulted in this book, Theology from Listening, which looked at things that are produced corporately by Quakers, so particularly books of discipline, books of faith and practice, and things which are written by committees rather than by individuals, looking for what are the things that come up repeatedly, and what are the, if there are central claims in Quaker theology, what are they? And I tried to summarize my findings in the title, which is really that for most liberal Quakers, theology comes from the practice of listening in unprogrammed meeting for worship.
Right. Oh, okay. So okay. No, that's and that was
I said so much at one side.
No, I mean that's so. And what time period was that across? I mean, so.
So for theology from listening, I looked at liberal Quakers across the 20th century.
Across the whole of the 20th. Wow.
What I called the long 20th century. So I started it at the Manchester Conference in 1895 as a kind of marker on liberal Quakerism, at least in Britain, and then brought it up just into the beginning of the 21st century.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting, because again, that kind of pushes against these theories of major change or rupture or fragmentation or dissolution. Yeah. So yeah, fantastic. You mentioned Rachel Muirs, and I suppose one of the common things for those of us who stay in academia is these ongoing relationships with colleagues, and would you call her a mentor, or have there been other mentors in your academic work?
Yeah, so Rachel was a great supervisor and has stayed as a mentor. My other PhD supervisor, Mikhail Burley, was also quite a mentor, and particularly I might not talk to him so much anymore, but I think of him as a role model. I think I was one of his first PhD students. So when I was starting out as a PhD supervisor, I was reflecting on that experience. I know you also have been a mentor. You were my external examiner for my PhD, and particularly now that we're working much more closely together in the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies, I think quite a lot of, particularly finding my way with the university relationships and things, we have regular conversations, which is very supportive. And also there have been quite a lot of people who helped in small ways along the way. So Woodbrook's previous librarian, Betty Hagland, has helped me in lots of ways. Susan Robson, who did a PhD in Quaker Studies. I think she wasn't at Birmingham, was she? But
Huddersfield.
Huddersfield. But who did an impact project talking about her research and trying to put it out into the world by building a website and creating online resources. I worked with her for a while, and that's been quite influential on the way that I approach trying to make my research accessible and wanting to put it out in lots of different formats as well. So yeah, some of those, maybe they're more like colleague relationships as well, but they have that mentoring and inspirational element to them.
Yeah, and there is something very nice, I suppose, about the way in which those of us who work in Quaker Studies, I mean, there's not that many, and we do form a global network. I know you've been to the American Academy of Religion to present, in the Quaker Studies unit and in other units, and we get to meet each other and know each other, which is great. So now here you are, you're obviously a established academic and supervising in your own right. So what kinds of projects do you particularly like to supervise, or what would you welcome people coming to you with?
So I'm interested in lots of projects. I'm interested in projects particularly that are interdisciplinary or that take a new approach to old material. So people might have picked up from what I've said about my own work that I'm often looking at bringing together things from different traditions, so using philosophical material to look at real examples of theological language, something like that. I'm interested in, you described my work on theology from listening as challenging what's gone before, and that's often something that's quite exciting as an academic development. I think I'm interested in projects that people are passionate about, right? That always helps. Yes. Practically getting through something. And I'm capable of being convinced to be interested in actually quite a wide range of things in Quaker studies. If there's something that's a new contribution that people are passionate about, that puts something in a new perspective or brings a new approach to it. So yeah, it's maybe not so much about specific topics or kinds of content, but about that way of thinking about things.
Okay, and you've obviously got a very strong background both in theology and philosophy. So would those be the main disciplines that you'd be looking to supervise in? Or, I mean, what if someone came with some history or some social science?
Yeah, so I think I've also done work in social science. So the Afterwards project, for example, used doing a big survey. I've done bits of interviewing and things like that for other research projects. Quite often what I'd say for something, if it's maybe in history or social science, but it has an overlap with the areas that I'm an expert in, is let's build a supervision team where we've got expertise in different areas. So I mentioned that I had 2 PhD supervisors, and it's common, I think almost standard practice now, for people to have more than one supervisor. So there are lots of options for bringing in expertise and for teaching me about things I don't know, as well as bringing my expertise to a project. So I think if someone's maybe got a project in history or sociology that they think I'd be interested in, maybe that touches on some of those questions about religious language or theology or how Quaker practice has changed over time, questions like that. It would be about building a supervision team that brought all the different kinds of expertise we need to a project, because it's going to be very rare that one supervisor, if they already knew everything, there wouldn't be a new project to do that.
Is there anything, I mean, this might be a difficult question to answer, but anything you think, oh, I wish somebody would come to me wanting to look at X or Y, or something you're interested in but haven't got the time to follow up yourself, perhaps?
Well, I mean, if someone came to me and said, actually, I want to do that linguistics work that follows up on my own PhD research, I'd definitely be excited to be involved in that. I also, in that work, I only looked at Quakers in the last 50 years and in Britain Yearly Meeting. And there would be lots of exciting work to do in taking that more international. So I wrote several grant applications trying to get the opportunity to do that work on Quakers, particularly in North America. And I didn't manage to get the funding yet, but there's definitely an opportunity there to look at other liberal yearly meetings, but also to look at other yearly meetings in general, and to look at different Quaker traditions. How have these things evolved? Lots of Quaker traditions draw on early Quaker sources, but take those early friends off in different directions. And looking at that, some of the uses of Quaker history is something that I'm just beginning work on. And if someone was interested in a particular area of that, how has this figure from Quaker history been understood? How has Elizabeth Fry been used? How did she end up on £5 note,
Yeah.
something like that, there would be lots of really exciting projects in that area as well.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I'm just thinking, I mean, we might assume that liberal friends in other yearly meetings would use the lists that you've identified British friends using, and then we might not expect that in other kinds of yearly meeting, but we don't really know. So yeah, lots of work to be done.
Yeah, it would be good to really test those assumptions rather than letting them be assumed.
Sure. So, would you say you have a particular supervisory style? I mean, if you think about your relationships with your students, how might you describe them or characterize them, or what goes on in a meeting, for example?
Yeah, it's difficult to characterize one's style in comparison with other people, because you don't usually sit in on other people's supervisions. But I guess my style is quite collaborative. It's quite a lot about starting by listening to where the student is at the moment. So in a typical PhD supervision with me, I'm going to start by saying, what have you done in the last month or so? Tell me how it's been going. People have often submitted work, so I might say, I've read that. One or two headlines about that are, how does it feel to you? What do you think needs doing next? And getting people's perspective on their own work first, and then building on that. I think quite often, it depends what stage people are at, but quite often in a supervision we would talk about the process that's involved. So the process of doing research, the process of interviews that you're doing at the moment, how is that going? What does it feel like? What issues are coming up? What's going well? Another stage we might talk about the process of writing. How do you develop a good academic writing style? What do people expect when they're reading a PhD thesis? How can you make it easier for the reader to follow what you're saying? How can you make sure you're ticking the boxes that the examiners are going to be looking for? Maybe supporting people in finding other literature, so suggesting books that I think are useful, or suggesting search strategies. Have you tried this database? Have you tried looking for these keywords? Thinking through collaboratively with somebody what needs to be found, what do we need to check to make sure we haven't missed something, yeah, so that it develops as the project develops. And I think different people's working styles are quite different, so some people benefit from being given a deadline, and I'll say, actually, I want to see this many words by this date, please. And other people, that's just going to be frightening. So we might do experiments and say, let's try it this way this month, and then next time we meet, we'll review that. And if that didn't work for you, if it didn't produce the results we want, or if actually it just stressed you out, we'll try something different another time. Particularly a PhD project is quite an extended research process. So you're in a supervision relationship with someone for quite a number of years, and I think over that time you can get to know each other and find ways of working together. And I'd be always looking to see, how can I support somebody? What's going to help them and support their process, rather than saying this is the way it must be done and trying to force a process on somebody.
Right, great. So I mean, there's what comes across is lots of questions rather than lots of answers, and as you say, a collaborative approach. And yeah, thank you. We did have a question last time which came through, and that was, if somebody's they're passionate about a project, and they start off, and of course they need to put in a research proposal in order to be accepted by the university. Excuse me. And then they discover something else. Is it possible to kind of change tack and move into a new area?
Yeah, so I think in almost every project, it happens that you discover something new, right? That's what you're there for. And that leads to small changes in the direction or the approach that you take. You find out that something won't work, or you didn't find what you were expecting to find. So that kind of change is a normal part of the process. And it's also possible to make a much bigger change, to say, okay, I started out to research this period of history, but actually I really haven't found what I was expecting. Like, actually the records aren't there, or something quite major, and so I'm going to ask the same question but about 100 years later, or I'm going to ask the same question but about a different place. And so those quite major changes of direction are also possible, and just occasionally people like completely switch disciplines or something. Some of those really bigger changes have to be cleared by the university, because you're effectively stopping and starting a new project. But research is quite a flexible process, and it is that personal relationship I was talking about is also, you as a researcher have an ongoing and developing relationship with the topic that you're working on. And like any other relationship, sometimes that goes through really big changes. So yeah, I think those things are quite common, and there is a level at which you have to go through a formal process to make a change, but that is possible. And actually these things can be really surprisingly flexible in a lot of cases.
Yes, thank you. And creative in some ways. Now I have had a question through saying, how do you maintain your passion through the stresses of doing a PhD? So obviously that assumes it's a stressful process. You might like to comment on that, but also about maintaining the passion.
Yeah, and I think most things are going to be stressful at some stage. If you work intensely on something for 3 years full time, or maybe 6 or years or even longer, there are going to be times when stressful stuff happens in your life, and that puts a stress on the process. And there are going to be times when you think, oh, why am I doing this? Or those changes, times of change are often stressful, and it can be really creative, it can be really positive when you look back on it. But when you're going through that process, I think maybe not everybody has a stressful experience with their PhD, but it's extremely common to have some periods that are stressful during that process. I think going into it looking at a topic that you're genuinely passionate about in the first place is a big help to maintaining that. And I think there are things you can do throughout, actually not working too intensely and trying to maintain a balance. So if you're full-time, making sure that you have hobbies and family and connection and things outside the PhD as well. But also for part-time students, it can be a really tricky balance. How much of my time do I spend on the PhD work, and how do I balance it with the other calls on my time? But getting that right, so that there are times when you step away, and we all need a holiday sometimes, and actually that's true for something that you're doing as a passion project as well as something that's paid employment. And often revisiting the roots and saying, why did I start this to begin with? And actually, and during my own PhD, I think sometimes I even went back and reread my research proposal and said, what was I interested in? What was the core of this? And sometimes that's changed. Sometimes you've discovered something new and really interesting. But also it can be worth going back to the core of it and saying, what is the main purpose of this why am I doing it? Who does this affect? Who else is interested in it? And I'm quite an introvert, so this wasn't so much a factor for me. But I know for some of my colleagues, people who are doing PhDs alongside me, finding an audience and actually going to a conference and presenting something, or finding a fellow student who's working on something similar that you can share that passion with, actually that can be really supportive. And in Quaker Studies, I think we're quite good at that, and because we have that international community that you were talking about, and within CRQS, that student community where people do have an opportunity to meet each other and to share those interests as well as the struggles that they're having along the way. I think that helps a lot of people to maintain that kind of energy and to keep going even through what are sometimes the long, boring bits of the technical parts of a PhD.
Okay, thank you. That's great. So we've mentioned Susan Robson, who did her PhD at Huddersfield. You were at Leeds, I was at Brighton. You know, we weren't part of CRQS. There are people doing Quaker Studies outside of the centre we look after. So, I mean, why should people come to CRQS?
I think actually I did feel a bit like part of CRQS because I was aware of what was happening there and able to participate in some of the student activities. And I think if people are wondering where to go, I would say probably the most important thing is to choose a supervisor. Actually, there's a reason we've chosen Meet the Supervisors as the theme for these events, because finding someone who's also interested in, passionate about the area that you want to work on is really helpful, and someone who has the relevant expertise and already has a good background knowledge of the general area is really important. And beyond that, I think at Birmingham now we've got a really good student community, so both within CRQS but also the wider postgraduate student community at Birmingham has particularly adapted with the pandemic and become quite welcoming and inclusive of distance learning students and people who are working in different ways. So the shut up and work sessions that some people go to, which is a session of several hours on Monday night where people can talk to each other, but also have a time where they're kind of accompanied just to get on with a solid block of work. So I think there's that sense of community, and as well as having us as the expert resource, there are the resources of the library. Birmingham's got an excellent library, and there's also the library at Woodbrook that CRQS students have access to. So I think that community and those resources are really powerful draws for people coming to Woodbrook and to CRQS.
Thank you, Rhiannon. So you mentioned before about putting your work out in different places, and I think it's been there's a particular contrast, I suppose, between how you and I have worked. In that I was told doing my PhD I sounded too much like a Quaker, and I needed to develop a kind of non-Quaker academic persona that talks about Quakers as they, and and then using even a different form of my name to write as a Quaker. Where you've in a way just cut across all that, and you produce fantastic academic texts, and then use the same material to produce highly accessible books. But even in your academic writing, I think you're much more flexible and fluid around, and maybe more honest about who you are as a academic author. So I mean, if that's a fair characterization, I mean, am I just part of what's now disappearing and becoming a little more flexible, do you think? Or do you find it difficult in a way to cut across that kind of academia, the rest divide?
I think there are several things going on there. Some of this is probably about personality, and but it's also, so maybe there's a generational difference, right? And actually, what you and other people, so Rachel Mewers has also taken a different approach, and coming as a younger scholar into a space where Quaker studies is already established as a discipline, for example, I'm working in quite a different environment to the situation that you would have been in during your own PhD. I think there's also a disciplinary difference. So, I was encouraged to use I argue that in this essay I am going to, and I think that's looked on quite differently in philosophy and theology to perhaps in social sciences. I think in theology in particular, there's it's much more common to both be an academic and serving your community in some way. So there are these questions about what does it mean to be researching Quakers when you're also a Quaker, but actually, what does it mean to be doing Anglican theology when you're also an Anglican? Well, people look at that question quite differently, because why would you do Anglican theology if you're not an Anglican? So coming up with an academic training in that theological field, there's quite a different approach sometimes to those kinds of questions. And I think, I think there's also that wanting things to be accessible. So there are things about writing style, but there are also things about price point and how do you reach a different audience. So it's funny you should ask me this question, actually, because I just the other day did a TikTok about putting academic work out in different formats. So I'm also doing lots of different formats. And I think it's quite a lot about knowing that my own community are interested in this work. So one of the things people have identified, so one of our old PhD students, Stuart Yarlett, wrote about the ways that some Quakers have used your sociological work to ground what they wanted to say about what the Quaker community should be like, where you tried to describe what it was like.
Yes.
And I think people are interested in this kind of academic work and making the research accessible, which includes publishing open access. So the journal Quaker Studies that you used to be editor of and now I'm a co-editor of is open access, and I think that's a huge improvement. I think things like rewriting things for a different audience, using different mediums, so doing a Facebook Live, being on TikTok, reaching out and being accessible and available in a way that maybe doesn't go with the stereotype of an academic in an ivory tower. But I'm against the ivory trade, and I'm not going to live in an ivory tower.
Okay, lovely, thank you. So we're coming to the end of our time now. I wondered if you could talk about either current research or things up ahead that you're excited about, or writing projects. Sorry.
Yeah, so a major research project that I'm just starting or just thinking about what shape it should take is about the different ways that Quaker history has been used in different situations. So I'm giving a paper at the American Academy of Religion conference this November, which will introduce some of my early findings in that project. But I think there are several specific things that I might do within that. So I'm quite interested in kind of popular culture and how things like songs and children's books and leaflets that go with here's a tour about places George Fox went and things like that, use and reuse bits of Quaker history and sometimes don't give a picture that matches up with either the official history in history books or some of the more recent work that's been done by academics and kind of uncovered some of the complexities and the nuances of that history. So yeah, I'm just starting work on that, and I think some of it, we've got this big anniversary coming up for George Fox, and I think some of it might focus on how the previous anniversaries were used. There's some quite interesting stuff there. At a previous anniversary, there was a big conference where people published papers and said, this is what George Fox means to us today. And actually, even just 20 or 30 years on, some of that has quite changed, and people's attitudes to early Quakers and to Fox as an individual are quite different, as different concerns arise in wider society and also in the Society of Friends specifically. So I'm hoping to keep on researching that, and in due course, maybe there'll be a book or two, but I don't have a clear picture of the timescale for that yet.
So in 2024, when there will be a whole series of events, probably marking the 400th anniversary of George Fox's birth, rightly or wrongly, this will be great data for you in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, so, absolutely. So I shall be taking notes for all your anniversary events, friends.
And I'm sure if there's one book, there will be two, because again, you are just very good at meeting the needs of different audiences. So good. Well, we've coming up to the end of our Rhiannon. Thank you so much for sharing so freely and fully. It's been really interesting listening to you, and we will be back, or I will be back on September the 22nd with John Kirshner, another member of the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies Supervisory team, at the slightly earlier time of 2 p.m. But September the 22nd will be the next in the series of Meet the Supervisors. So I hope you've enjoyed this, whether you're watching it live or later, and you can always feel free to contact either Rhiannon or myself via our Woodbrook email. Thank you. Thanks, Rhiannon, very much. Bye-bye.